You're listening to Factual America.
MLK FBI is a documentary that looks at the high point of Dr. King's career in America from the 60s up to his assassination in 1968, April 4th, 1968, and how, as he was trying to break the backs of segregation in America, he was constantly being surveilled and monitored by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. He was wiretapped, he was, watched. He had informants in his organization. They were constantly trying to figure out how to discredit Dr. King and his reputation. So this documentary looks at both who King was, what he was having to confront and deal with on a daily basis with the FBI, and also at the same time giving you an understanding of the trajectory of the history of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we're going to talk a little bit about all these things in a little more detail here shortly. So basically, this surveillance, which I guess many of us have been aware of, but which you now document very, very well for us, it has its roots in the Red Scare, doesn't it, of the 50s?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We come out of World War II. America had just defeated Germany and Japan and Italy. And, and we had a relationship during the war with the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. And then all of a sudden in the late 40s, the notion of communism became the next sort of red herring in American history, where everybody looked around the corner and said, if you were a communist, you were trying to destroy the fabric of American democracy. And one of the strongest proponents of trying to destroy communism in America was the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who was obsessed with the Communist Party. And so he was looking to find anyone who might have been connected, like the Rosenbergs, like Robert Oppenheim, anybody who was connected with the Communist Party, and trying to make sure that they didn't infiltrate or destroy America. And so what happened in the 50s, when Dr. King became a leader of the civil rights movement with the Montgomery bus boycott, and developed a relationship in the late 50s, early 60s with a gentleman named Stanley Levinson, who had been a former member of the Communist Party, that immediately raised the hackles on J. Edgar Hoover's neck to say, here's this civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, this Negro, who's in conversation and having meetings with a communist, a former communist, Stanley Levinson. And his feeling was that the Communist Party was trying to co-opt Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And there had always been the concern that African Americans who were unhappy with segregation in America were being approached by members of the Communist Party as early as the 1930s.
Yeah. And I think you've got a great archival footage there of Dr. King saying what he finds the most remarkable is that more African Americans hadn't become communists.
Members of the Communist Party. Very upfront about it. Absolutely right. Because for many who thought the Communist Party was a way to sort of deal with segregation, it became something that was attractive.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's to the point that even John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, even tell Dr. King to cool it, to stop these associations with Stanley Levinson, don't they?
Yeah, because J. Edgar Hoover had gotten Bobby Kennedy to approve the wiretapping, the monitoring of Dr. King because of his so-called connections with Stanley Levinson. And when that information was brought to the Kennedys, right before the March in Washington, King went to the White House and met with John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, who told him, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to distance himself from Stanley Levinson and anybody who was in his organization who had any connections with the Communist Party. Now, the reality of it was that Dr. King said to these gentlemen, the President of the United States and the Attorney General, that he was going to sever his ties with Stanley Levinson and other members in his organization who had communist affiliations or previous communist ties. But in reality, he didn't. He didn't separate himself or distance himself from Stanley Levinson, even though he did with some other people, but he told these gentlemen that he was. But he continued to have Stanley Levinson as a very close confidant.
Yeah. And then, so this, as you've already said, I mean, this, for J. Edgar Hoover, this was a way of justifying wiretaps and bugging hotel rooms and these sort of things. Even Dr. King's speechwriter, Clarence Jones's house is fully wiretapped.
Exactly.
So you document that very well in the film. And then what they, how best to put it, they stumble upon things about Dr. King's extra, of his personal life, and this kind of takes on a whole different form of I don't know. It takes a turn basically.
Takes a deep turn,
Yeah.
Matthew. I mean, all of a sudden, here they're listening, they're wiretapping Dr. King, they're eavesdropping on his conversations
Yeah.
and on what's happening in these hotel rooms. And lo and behold, they realized that he was having these extramarital affairs.
Yeah.
And for Hoover and one of his right-hand men, William Sullivan, they saw this as an opportunity that they thought could really discredit Dr. King. Not only was he having these extramarital affairs, but he was a Christian minister.
Yeah.
Who was basically talking about nonviolent protests from the pulpits of his church, and pulpits of other churches around the country. And here he is having these illicit affairs. They thought that they had found the thing that could destroy who they thought was one of the most dangerous Negroes in America, by releasing this information about Dr. King's illicit affairs. Now, the thing to remember is here we are in the mid-'60s where the press at that time did not take the bait. They did not take material that looked at people's deeply personal lives to use in the press. The world has changed radically since then. But back then, the illicit affairs of someone like Dr. King or even John F. Kennedy
exactly
was not open game.
That's interesting. I mean, why do you think that was, and why has this all changed? Because it's true. I mean, if sports figures, name it, whoever was in the public eye, these sort of things, probably a lot of journalists knew things or were given tips, but they just would, as you said, never would take the bait.
It was a different world we lived in. I mean, think about it. It was a world back then where men wore suit and ties, where, there was a certain sort of what I call American gentility.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you were going to spread on the front pages that John Kennedy was involved with Marilyn Monroe or that Dr. King was having these extramarital affairs was not something they would do. And you've seen how it's flipped 180 degrees since then. Everything is gained. But what's fascinating to me, though, Matthew, is that even though things now are being published and seen on television about people's personal lives, for some people, it doesn't seem to have much impact.
Well, that's true.
We've become so neutered to scandal and stuff that even though you may bring out all the horrific things in the personal life of Donald J. Trump, it doesn't seem to stick.